Friday, July 5th, 2 o'clock in the East, where a deadline has just passed for the White House to announce whether it will keep fighting to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. A federal judge in Maryland overseeing one of 3 separate lawsuits over the question ruled that the Trump administration must explain how it's going to proceed by 2 p.m. today. President Trump addressed the controversy with reporters earlier.
We're thinking about doing that. It's one of the ways. We have 4 or 5 ways we can do it. It's one of the ways, and we're thinking about doing it very seriously. We're doing well in the census. No, he made a statement. He wrote something out. The judge didn't like it. I have a lot of respect for Justice Roberts, but he didn't like it. But he did say, come back. Essentially, he said, come back. That's what he was saying. So we'll see what happens.
The case seemed all but settled just a few days ago. The Supreme Court ruled last week that the Commerce Department's current justification for putting the question on the census was not legally sound, calling it contrived. And the government has even begun printing copies of the census without the question included. But earlier this week, the president, reportedly spurred on by conservative allies, announced on Twitter that his administration would once again take up the fight, sending White House lawyers scrambling over the holiday to come up with a new argument. Joining me now, NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, you've had a lot of specific guidance that you've been giving us through the day about...
Pardon me for... I'm just going to look away. This is going to panic everyone that's speaking to me in my ear. I'm listening, but I'm looking at something that's just been filed, so go ahead.
Well, that's what we're waiting for. There was a 2 p.m. deadline for a filing in which the government either had to say, we're going to continue on with this fight, or it could say, we're not continuing. The 2 p.m. deadline, the most important thing that would happen is if we heard the government say, we're giving it up. So that's essentially what we're waiting for. If the government doesn't choose to withdraw its fight to add a citizenship question, then things continue as they are. The census will be printed. The government will have to figure out a new way to get it on there, and that may not happen.
So this is what's just a second ago been filed by the government, and no surprise here, they say we're going to keep fighting. They file what they call their proposed discovery plan, and what they say is they lay out a schedule for how to continue in this Maryland lawsuit, this separate lawsuit from the Supreme Court case on the census form. So no surprise here. The government says it wants to continue fighting.
So while you read that, here's what I want to lay out. The government says it's going to continue fighting. For the moment, the government continues to print the census forms because that was the argument they used, that they needed a judgment or at least some kind of guidance from the Supreme Court before June 30th in order to print these forms. So those forms continue to be printed. The government's not giving up its fight. Logistically, Pete, what happens next? What can happen?
All right, so here are the options based on what I've just been able to read from what the government has filed and what the other side in this case has filed. So first we have the Supreme Court case. That was started from a lawsuit filed by 18 states led by New York, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Last week, the Supreme Court said this explanation that Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross gave for why he wanted the question on the form clearly doesn't wash. It's a pretext. You can't print the census if that's the basis for the wanting it on the form. So the Supreme Court has ordered the government not to print the census with that question on it. And in fact, it's now printing it without that question. So what are the alternatives? One is Wilbur Ross could come up with a new justification for it. That would start a whole new round of litigation. The government clearly thinks that's not a very productive way because they thought earlier this week it was all over, and then the president said, you got to keep trying. Another possibility that the president himself raised today is the president simply signs an executive order directing the Commerce Department to tell the Census Bureau to put this question on the form. That, again, would start a whole new round of litigation. All these, anything the government does from here on.
Let's just stop at that one for a second. Executive orders. This president certainly believes, and by the way, he's not the first president to think so, that certain things can be done by executive order. But is the president clear that an executive order to put the question on the census doesn't mean that the census gets printed with the citizenship question on it?
Correct. That it's not going to do it by itself because that will immediately produce another court challenge. Anything the government does from here on is going to produce a court challenge. That's a certainty. So back to your question using the word logistics, how long would that take? How long does the government have before it really can't has to just keep printing the forms without the question. I don't think anybody has a good, clear answer to when the final drop-dead date is for not tinkering around with this thing any further. It's going to cost a lot of money if they throw away all the forms they've already printed and start over again. Another option, though, would be to either include the citizenship question on the longer form, the household survey that goes to just a small percentage of U.S. households, or an additional form, an additional question that goes with the short form that goes to all households, just a simple piece of paper that says, are you a U.S. citizen, yes or no, what they wanted to put on the form in the first place. Now, that, too, I think would lead to litigation because the groups opposed to this say it would have the same kind of chilling effect. But, you know, as we think through all this, remember, no matter what you may think of this as a policy matter, of whether it's a wise thing to put this on the form, whether it will lead to an undercount or whether it will give us more information, that's a balancing test. Just recall that throughout most censuses in American history, there has been a citizenship question. So the government has some weight on its side if it can come up with a rationale that satisfies these challenges. Now, one other point. The president said today, when he was asked, why do you want this question on the form, said, well, you need it to figure out how many seats a state gets in the House. That is demonstrably not true. Mm-hmm. No apportionment throughout our history, and we've just celebrated another birthday, has ever been based on just counting citizens. It's always been total inhabitants. And that was clear from the Constitutional Convention and clear from when Congress enacted the 14th Amendment, which gave further guidance on how to conduct a census. So in that sense, you don't need citizenship data to apportion a membership in the House.
Pete, I'm going to give you the option. You can hang out with me while I bring Barbara McQuade in. I do know that you have some reading to do, so you're welcome to sit in front of that camera and do the reading. And if you hear something you want, chime in.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.